Last time we spoke about the conquest of Southern Manchuria. The Russians had consolidated their hold over Northern Manchuria and now had the necessary amount of forces to quell the chaos in the south. The two last major strongholds held by the Qing and their Boxer allies were Liaoyang and Mukden. The Russians consolidated their forces while the Qing spread themselves out far too thinly. Each engagement saw Russian victories despite the fact that Qing had the necessary numbers and weaponry to serve decisive defeats to the Russians, if only they consolidated and coordinated properly their forces. Liaoyang fell easily, and with its fall, the Qing commanders began to loot and abandon their own men. Leaderless, the infantry gradually scattered into the countryside, leaving Mukden pretty much open for the taking. Manchuria was in chaos, and within that chaos, the same type of people who always emerged to take advantage did: bandits. But who were these people really? This episode is the Red Bearded Honghuzi. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Why don't you watch something on the sillier side? Check out my recent episode on what if Godzilla actually attacked Japan in 1947. Also, please do check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel for more exclusive podcasts. Manchuria has been called by many names. An English study in 1932 by Hubert Hessel Tiltman referred to Manchuria as, quote, "the cockpit of Asia where drama never dies." It has also been called by Yu Jimin in 1929 as the Balkans in East Asia. And that last one, I think, fits very nicely. So you've heard me in length talk about Shandong province, and Manchuria for that matter. You heard my entire series on the Boxer Rebellion. Often you hear me refer to bandits in Shandong. We saw the precursors to the Boxers rise up primarily to combat these so-called bandits. China proper and Manchuria had bandits since ancient times. But who exactly were the bandits? I would like to take us back to Manchuria to talk about a specific group or a phenomenon of banditry. The major reason I am taking the time to do so, an entire episode on this by the way, is because, well, to be honest, we are about to jump into the Russo-Japanese War. And this banditry problem and these specific bandits will have an incredible amount of influence on China, Russia, and Japan for the first half of the 20th century. For those of you who have seen my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, you might already know where I'm going with this. I created an extremely long series and reformed it actually into a single documentary on China's warlord era. And to be honest, of all the work I've done, I do highly recommend watching the full documentary. It's becoming quite popular now, actually. It's picking up speed. It's a fascinating part of the history of modern China, and one I will tackle in this podcast series. God knows how long it will be. To be honest, it'll be its own series. It's going to be so long. Now, some of the warlords started out as bandits. Two in particular who were extremely influential were, of course, Zhang Zuolin and the dog-meat general Zhang Zongchang. By the way, if you want to hear more about the king of the memes, Zhang Zongchang, you can also go over to my personal channel and check out the episode I did on Zhang Zongchang, the monster behind the meme. You know, I do take some pride in that episode. I think I'm one of the few people on YouTube who actually went in depth looking into his history and it's a lot darker than people would think. The word Honghuzi translates loosely as Red Bearded. They were originally armed Chinese bandits who operated in northeast China, particularly in the areas of the eastern Russia-Chinese borderlands during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. The term Honghuzi is believed to originate back in the 1600s, referring to Russians by Chinese who had red beards. These would be the indigenous peoples around the Amur region. Chinese bandits later would use fake red beards as a disguise. Honghuzi gangs grabbed new members from those seeking easy money. It could be peasants, those down on their luck, Qing army deserters, recent immigrants, anybody. Just about anyone who preferred robbing over working the lumber mills or in the mines, as you can imagine. A Vladivostok newspaper wrote an article in 1896 referring to the phenomenon. Here he is, dirty, in rags, half-starved, laboring every day, in the rain, in clay-sticky soil. What joys in life does he have? No wonder he prefers joining the Honghuzi and a life full of adventures. A Honghuzi gang could be just two guys, or it could be several hundred strong. You can imagine large groups in the hundreds could perform larger-scale operations. Bigger the gang, bigger the payoff. When Honghuzi groups came together to perform large-scale operations, it could threaten entire cities. Now, I bet most of you have an image in your head of a skinny, unwashed hooligan probably wearing some worn-down rags, and obviously this could fit the description of many Honghuzi, but on average, not really. Many of them were well-dressed and extremely well-armed. They typically performed crimes in spring and summer when it was easier to hide in the forest-filled countryside or in the mountains. When I was speaking about Shandong province, I often mentioned these type of criminal seasons. Highway robbery literally was seasonal work. In the autumn and the winter times, the Honghuzi typically hit the major cities and spent their booty on the usual stuff: alcohol, women, and drugs. In this case, opium. Many also held employment. Like I said, it was seasonal work. Most of them were farmers. Manchuria was ideal for this type of criminal activity. The Qing government based in Beijing had little control over their sparsely populated homeland, and the local officials in Manchuria did not have sufficient resources to quell the Honghuzi. The Honghuzi also did not stop at local activity. They often crossed over to plunder Russian territory, such as the Ussuri-Krai. The Honghuzi had quite an easy time hitting the borderlands as the Russians and the Qing could not focus much resources to protect them. As you can imagine, such border issues resulted in larger-scale conflicts. When Honghuzi raided Russian territory, they often stole anything you can imagine, like cattle. They were smuggling opium, and even illegally performing gold mining. Illegal gold mining led to a clash between the Honghuzi and Russian forces. In 1867, when gold was discovered on a small island of Askold, some 50 kilometers away from Vladivostok, Manchurians began to come over to try their luck at gold mining, and as did the Honghuzi. A Russian schooner, the Alut, on several occasions scattered illegal gold miners. But they just kept returning. 3 Russian sailors were killed in an armed clash, and the Honghuzis chopped up their bodies in full view of the remaining crew, who fled in horror. The Russian government attempted to thwart the illegal gold mining, and this led to what was called the Manchu War. Manchu is another name for Manchu. In 1868, Manchu and Honghuzi coordinated attacks upon Russian military posts and plundered and burned several towns, massacring settlers. In retaliation, Russian troops began burning down Manchu settlements known to shelter Honghuzi. By mid-July, the Honghuzi were gradually tossed back across the border into Manchuria. The Russians were not done, however. Their forces pursued the Honghuzi as they fled back into Manchuria. Reportedly, a Cossack Satya penetrated Manchuria some several hundred kilometers pursuing Honghuzi. In 1879, Russian forces crossed the border and burnt down a well-known fortified Honghuzi fortress near Lake Kanka. Major Neujin led a detachment during this time, and he ran into some Qing troops and a small battle occurred. It was a rather embarrassing episode for the Russians, who had to apologize for the incident. The Qing court was not pleased with the border crossings, but they knew the nature of the Honghuzi menace and actually asked the Russians to continue pursuing the Honghuzi within their borders. Now I would like to talk about the stories of some famous Honghuzi. In 1875, Zhang Zuolin was born the third son of an impoverished family in Haicheng of Fengtian province, that is modern-day Liaoning province. His family had been rooted in Manchuria for a long time, but his father was unable to sustain the family after dividing the estate with Zhang's uncle. Jang only received 2 years of traditional education before leaving school following his father's death. From an early age, he was nicknamed the Pimple. Jang was a thin and short boy. Jang spent his early youth fishing, gambling, and brawling. When he first tried to make some money, he worked as a waiter at an inn, where he came across the tales of the Honghuzi. The only useful education he ever received was a bit of veterinary science. He underwent a brief period of veterinarian training, but ultimately he abandoned the career to pursue something else. When the First Sino-Japanese War broke out, Zhang Zuolin joined the Yi Army commanded by General Zongchang in 1894 to fight against the invading Japanese within Manchuria. However, when the war ended and the Yi Army redeployed, Jang, at the age of 21, departed them to take a job under his father-in-law to protect his village as the head of an armed band. There is a legend, most likely perpetuated by Zhang Zuolin himself, that during a hunting trip he spotted a wounded Honghuzi on horseback, and he killed the man before stealing his horse, and he became a Honghuzi himself. Jang led a group of bandits, and he earned this sort of Robin Hood-like mythos. Because he was illiterate, he often referred to his experience as a bandit leader as, quote, experience of the Green Forest. This was something his contemporary, Zhang Zongchang, would enthusiastically also state proudly. During this anarchy-filled period between the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, Honghuzi were both bandits plundering, but also militiamen protecting towns. It was a complex situation, and one that Zhang Zuolin would become an expert in. Soon after Jang had established his banditry group, it was dispersed by a larger group sponsored by the Russians. Jang and the survivors joined another Honghuzi group run by Zhang Jingwei. Zhang would gradually become its leader, and Zhang Jingwei would later become a lieutenant under Zhang Zuolin during the warlord era. When the Boxer Rebellion broke out, Zhang's gang joined the Qing army in their doomed resistance against the foreigners. Unlike the Boxers who ceased fighting when the war was over, the bandits kept on banditing. As Zhang's bandit group grew in size, he sought amnesty from the Qing government, and he became a militia commander in 1902. This would prove to be the first of a series of choices he made that would propel him to nearly become the leader of China. He was soon joined by Tang Yulin and Jiang Shouxian, who would in their own right become Fengtian leaders. It seems Zhang's willingness to form alliances was the key to his success. Now, I don't want to go too deep into this, but Zhang's militia was ordered by the Qing government to fight against Russian-sponsored Honghuzi during the Russo-Japanese War. His bandit force worked to escort traveling merchants within Manchuria during the war. Fighting as mercenaries, Zhang's group became recognized as a regular regiment within the Qing military, and they began patrolling the borderlands of Manchuria, suppressing other bandit groups. An American major surgeon named Louis Livingston Seaman was working for the 1st Regiment U.S. Volunteers Engineers during the Russo-Japanese War. His regiment was working with the 2nd IJA Army in Manchuria, and he personally met Zhang Zuolin, who he described in some length to the Nation magazine. He had some amusing and exciting experiences with the Honghuzi, ex-bandits, now nominally Chinese soldiery, many of whom were operating as guerrillas on the Russian flank and communications under Japanese officers as is charged. The Japanese had in their employ Zhang Zuolin, a famous Honghuzi leader who led his men against the Russians. Dr. Seaman wrote a lengthy report of his story with the Honghuzi and Zhang Zuolin, and I think it gives some flavor and a feeling of what the banditry types were like at their highest point. Dr. Seaman stated a Russian position had been swarmed by over 500 Honghuzi. The Russians took over 20 casualties before the Honghuzi horde were finally driven off. The Qing troops seemed to let the Honghuzi roam around freely, most likely because they cannot be caught, the plain truth being that the best of fellowship exists between them and the imperial troops, their old comrades of yore. Seaman noticed the Honghuzi had a special hatred reserved for the Russians. There was much talk of past grievances, particularly that of the Blagovinsk massacre, when it was said 8,000 unarmed men, women, and children were driven at a point of the bayonet into the raging Amur River. Seaman met one Qing Tao, who said Russian officers who participated in the brutal massacre had told him in 1900, "The execution of my orders made me almost sick, for it seemed as though I could have walked across the river on the bodies of the floating dead." Only 40 or so Chinese escaped the horror. Many of them were employed by a leading foreign merchant who ransomed their lives at 1,000 rubles apiece. Such atrocities were well remembered by the local Chinese who sought revenge. When Japan began to look for those sympathetic to their cause, willing to pay for it nonetheless, it was not hard to find enthusiastic Chinese. It was believed 10,000 or more Honghuzi divided into companies of around 200 to 300 each, led by Japanese officers no less, were in the force during the conflict. Zhang Zuolin commanded a large army of Honghuzi allied to the Japanese, and Dr. Seaman met him and his army while venturing near Niuchuang. There had been reports of raids by Honghuzi, also called the Red Beards, though none of them had red beards, or any kind of beard for that matter. Dr. Seaman's companion, Captain Boyd, became determined to meet them. The two men hoped to see for themselves the characteristics of these so-called 10,000-strong guerrilla fighters, who would fight on the western border area of Manchuria. They were said to be hitting the rear and right flank of the Russian army, compelling it to quadruple its Cossack guards in the region to protect supply trains and refugees trying to flee from Port Arthur to Mukden. Both men had Chinese passports and received official credentials from Minister Conger to meet with General Ma, who had assembled his forces on the borderland. General Ma was the commander-in-chief of the Qing forces in the region, and also the de facto commander of 10,000 Honghuzi now wearing Qing uniforms. Many of the Honghuzi were great horsemen, having Manchu backgrounds. They lived a mounted lifestyle, and for centuries had defied the Qing authorities, roaming at will, levying tribute and performing numerous crimes. The leader of these marauders was Zhang Zuolin, who now held the rank of colonel in the Qing army. Within 2 years, Zhang's band had obtained mastery over the entire border region of Manchuria, going some 100 miles. The Qing government ceased opposing them and simply made terms to adopt them into the army. Now they stood as troops in good standing, with highway robbery semi-officially recognized as one of their prerequisites. The adoption of the Honghuzi into the army had not changed their habits of murder and robbing, however. When they were not plundering Russian refugees en route to Siberia or Russian supply trains, they often would take to plundering on Chinese towns. Practically every peasant in the region at some time became a Honghuzi. It seemed to be at the time the crops were nearly fully grown, when the broom corn was about 12 to 15 feet high, when the peasants were most likely to turn to the life of an outlaw. The staple crop of Kaoliang affords the perfect cover for troops, or Honghuzi after all. The Eight Nation Alliance troops realized this the hard way when they marched from the Daku forts to Beijing. With the tall Kaoliang to hide their movements, the peasants abandoned their legitimate work and took up weapons either alone or in groups to plunder the highways or rob smaller villages near where they lived. Sometimes people banded together to fight off the Honghuzi. The Americans said it was a very similar situation in the Philippines during their little war. The Filipinos would call them amigos, then don on the clothes of the banditry class and try to rob them. Niuchuang was visited by large organized robbers, many from Kaopangzi. Dr. Seaman had the chance to take a photograph of Li Hangzhang and himself in the palace of the old viceroy in Beijing, shortly before his death. It was the last picture of the old statesman, whom he knew very well by this point. He had made several visits to Beijing. Dr. Seaman stopped at a Chinese inn and came across a merchant from Husmingtung. The man was suffering from an affliction, which he was able to relieve in some measure. The merchant heard he was traveling north and sought to meet the Honghuzi. He advised them to go at once to Husmingtung, where Zhang Zuolin was commanding forces. He even gave them a letter of introduction. The man turned out to be one of Zhang Zuolin's merchants. The letter proved very useful, as when they traveled further, people in the towns gave them better accommodations. They were greeted like friends. Husmingtung was a terminus of the railroad that connected Kaopingsu with the main line from Tientsin. They were in the process of building the main line further to junction at Mukden. They arrived to Husmingtung and received special rooms from the merchant's friends. There were Cossacks patrolling north and east, and the Japanese to the southeast. Qing soldiers under General Ma were patrolling west and northwest, and the Honghuzi were all around them. The two men bought fireworks and had a small party with the locals, establishing a standing within their community. The men then called upon the Chifu, the prefect of the place, whose name was Cong Zhaoku, and he received them cordially. Then they were finally presented to the great ex-bandit of all of Manchuria, the leader of the Honghuzi, Zhang Zuolin, who at this point was a colonel in the Qing army. Zhang Zuolin was a handsome fellow, graceful, and mild-mannered. He made them feel at home in his luxurious yamen, and he brewed them excellent tea in fine porcelain cups. Then he offered them a good bottle of wine, an old Madeira. The men took photos of Zhang Zuolin and his horses. Zhang told them they were now his guests, and that he had to attend some matters. They had the liberty to travel through the country at will, but to make sure they never traveled unattended to or unarmed. In the meantime, the men spoke with a guest of the Chifu named Chang Linglong from Mukden. He spoke about Zhang Zuolin, saying years ago he ruled all the territory around with an iron fist as a bandit, doing as he pleased west of the Liao River. When China absorbed him and his men into the army, he obtained an allowance to pay his men very well. The government supplied them as well. The two men learned what they had suspected. These Honghuzi were now really officered by the Japanese. There were around 300 with Zhang Zuolin as his personal guard. There were 8 Japanese officers directing the operations of another band the two men had visited. It was said that Zhang Zuolin paid handsomely for all of this. Some of the Japanese officers were disguised as Chinese and doing covert work. Their guerrilla operations were embarrassing Kuropatkin's army, robbing their supply trains, forcing the Russians to double guards on the lines of communication, and adding more units to the right flank and rear. 2 days before the two men arrived, a party of Russians were attacked by over 200 Honghuzi, 7 miles from Husmingtung. 5 were killed, 4 were decapitated, their heads placed on pike poles. The same group of bandits wiped out a Cossack escort that was moving 1,000 cattle and ponies to the Russian troops. The entire herd was stolen. Over 1,000 Cossacks began revenge raids in the region in retaliation. At the outset of the meeting of Zhang Zuolin, he showed an unusual amount of attention. Trumpet summoned his entire guards of 300 men. There was a great commotion, and soon the whole outfit of his forces began lining up for inspection and Kodak designs. Zhang gave 20 special guards for the two men's disposal. The next morning they went on an expedition of sightseeing. The plan was to visit neighboring bands, but when they reached 5 miles northeast, several Cossack scouts forced them away. They spent the night in Kaopingsu with 5 Japanese officers supported by a large number of Honghuzi. They took a railway train in the end to part ways. Now all of that was just a glimpse at a future warlord of Manchuria as he ascended being a small-time bandit to being the leader of the strongest bandit group in Manchuria and eventually found himself a larger role in the Qing military. Another infamous warlord who started out as a bandit was, of course, Zhang Zongchang. Certainly the most notorious of China's warlords, Zhang Zongchang was in all essence a complete monster. Google or YouTube, search his name, and you will see meme videos everywhere. Though, might I add, I made a video talking about the funny parts of his life, but also the cold, hard horror show that it actually was. Check out Zhang Zongchang, the monster behind the meme. Zhang Zongchang was born in 1881 in Yi County, present-day Laizhou in Shandong Province. He grew up in an impoverished village. His father worked as a head shaver and a trumpeter, and he was a rampant alcoholic. His mother was basically what you would call a practicing witch. She performed exorcisms for money. The family moved to Manchuria when Jang was in his teens, and then his parents separated. Jang stayed with his mother, who took on a new lover. Jang quickly took to a life of crime in and around Harbin. He took up work as a pickpocket, a prospector, worked as a bouncer, and found himself eventually working as a laborer in Siberia. He picked up a lot of Russian, which would pay off big time down the road. He described himself as a graduate of the School of Forestry, because he was illiterate. He became a hell of a big guy. He was apparently 6'6". That would make him the tallest of the warlords. That was not all that was tall. If you know the meme, you know the meme. When the Russo-Japanese War broke out, while Zhang Zuolin was helping the Japanese, Zhang Zongchang helped the Russians. He served as an auxiliary for the Imperial Russian Army. It was basically the same situation of Zhang Zuolin. He was a Honghuzi gang leader. However, his real fame came after the war. During the war, he showed himself to be a very capable warrior and a leader. He was known for splitting melons, that was bashing the skulls in of his enemies using rifle butts. Jang made a ton of friends amongst the Russian military. He got along very well with them. He acquired an enormous taste for fine things, particularly cigars, champagne, and whiskey. Google him and you will probably see a cigar in his mouth. Now, unlike Zhang Zuolin, Zhang Zongchang really only starts to do famous deeds after the Russo-Japanese War, so I don't want to go too far into the future, but I will give you a taste. For one thing, you're probably all wondering why he was notoriously known as the Dog Meat General. The nickname Dog Meat General was said to be based on his fascination with the domino game Paiji. Others say it was his favorite brand of tonic, which happened to be called dog meat. But of course, there was the rumor he ate a meal of black chow chow dog every day, as it was popularly believed at the time that it boosted a man's vitality. I do not believe that last part of the nickname rumors because he happened to be a huge dog lover, and there is evidence of that. There was also a rather sick rumor that when he was just a child and he was starving in poverty, he had to kill dogs and eat them to survive, and that's where the nickname came. Now, he had other nicknames, like the Lanky General or the General with 3 long legs, which were certainly something he publicized himself heavily. There was indeed the rumor that his nickname Old 86 referred to the length of his penis being the size of 86 Mexican silver dollars. He was also nicknamed 72 Cannon Jang, referring to that length again. He really loved publicizing those rumors. And I mean, the man was 6'6". People described him as, quote, with the physique of an elephant, the brain of a pig, and the temperament of a tiger. Alongside his penis propaganda, he was a legendary womanizer. Take his other nickname, for example, the General of 3 I Don't Knows. He did not know how many women he had, how many troops he had, or how much money he had. I think that name fits him the best. He also gave himself another nickname, which was the General of Justice and Might. Zhang Zongchang had a ton of concubines. The exact number of concubines has been variously reported to be between 30 to 50, but historians have had a hard time trying to fix the numbers, as Zhang Zongchang himself allegedly did not know the number. Allegedly, his concubines were from 26 different nationalities, each with her own washbowl marked with a flag of her nation. He was also said to give his concubines numbers since he could not remember their names nor speak their various languages. Many of these women he married. He was a polygamist after all. There were concubines known to be Chinese, Japanese, Russian, Korean, Mongolian, and at least one American amongst Zhang's women. Zhang Zongchang was semi-literate. Whenever people asked where he was educated, he would say, the College of the Green Forest, a euphemism for banditry. Despite being semi-literate, Zhang Zongchang is famously known for poetry. You knew this was coming. Most notably his most famous poem, which I of course will read to you, his poem on bastards. You tell me to do this. He tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go fuck your mother. Now, I hate to break it to some of you who are fascinated with this character, but a lot of his poetry might not be written by him. Yes, a lot of the poetry attributed to Zhang Zongchang may have been fabricated by a political opponent named Han Fuzhu, who took over Shandong province after him. Now that's enough about the two Zhangs. Trust me, we are going to be digging in to these guys much later on in the series. Because hell, I love the warlord era. It's absolutely insane, and very unknown to the West. So the Honghuzi are often called just bandits, but they had a lot of influence in Manchuria. They are another piece of the larger puzzle, as they say. The enormous amount of bandits in Manchuria alongside the Boxer movement is what drove Russia to invade Manchuria. The Russians sent over 177,000 troops into Manchuria, under the guise it was merely to protect their railway construction efforts. This raised a lot of eyebrows, as they say. By 1902, order had been restored to Beijing, and the armed forces were thinning out. Britain and Japan were very wary of Russia's increasing influence in the Far East. Britain and Japan actually would enter into an alliance on January the 30th of 1902. The terms dictated that if either nation was to go to war to protect its regional interest against a third power, the unaffected party would not only remain neutral, but would try to prevent the conflict from widening. So let's say if an additional power, like France or Germany, joined the war, either Japan or Britain would help the other. The alliance worked to Japan's favor, allowing her to consolidate her recent acquisition of Korea and bolster her interest in Manchuria. Russia countered this by declaring a similar alliance on March the 16th of 1902 with France. Now, everyone expected Russia to withdraw her enormous troops from Manchuria, and on April the 8th of 1902, during the Manchurian Convention, Russia confirmed her ultimate aim to evacuate Manchuria on the condition the railway and Russian citizens were protected by the Chinese. It was agreed the Russian withdrawal would be done in 3 phases, over 3 periods of time, each being 6 months. After the first 6 months, the first assigned territory, southwest of Mukden, was evacuated and returned to China. The anticipated second phase of the withdrawal from the remainder of the province of Mukden and Kirin did not occur, however. When the Qing ambassador in St. Petersburg inquired what the delay was, he was waved off. Then, 20 days after the withdrawal had begun, Beijing was presented with demands for concessions in Manchuria. None of the returned territory was in any way to be given to another power. Mongolia's system of government was to not be altered. No new ports or towns were to be developed or opened in Manchuria without informing Russia. Foreigners serving in the Chinese government were not to exercise authority in northern Manchuria. The telegraph line connecting the Liaodong Peninsula with Beijing was to be assured. On Nuchuang being returned to China, the customs dues were to be continued to be paid into the Russo-Japanese Bank. The rights acquired by Russian interest or Russian people were to continue. On April 29th, encouraged by the protests in support of Britain, the United States, and Japan, China rejected the 7 demands. Japan was greatly threatened by all of this, and little by little, the same situation we saw unfold prior to the First Sino-Japanese War was occurring all over again in Manchuria. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Want to hear more about Zhang Zongchang? Check out my episode on Zhang Zongchang, the monster behind the meme. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel for more exclusive podcasts. The Honghuzi were a unique type of banditry, and they had an enormous role in the history of Manchuria. Those like Zhang Zuolin and Zhang Zongchang would join their ranks and earn great fame. With so many bandits in Manchuria, however, conflict would soon arise.